Silicon Valley has a motto: fake it till you make it. It's how Airbnb pitched empty apartments as a travel revolution. It's how Uber promised a ride in 10 minutes before they had enough drivers. It's how almost every billion-dollar startup in the last 20 years was born. And for a long time, it worked. Until Elizabeth Holmes faked something you cannot fake and people died. This is not just a story about one woman who lied. That story has been told by HBO, by journalists, by a podcast with 40 million downloads. What hasn't been told clearly enough is the story of the system that made her possible. The investors who didn't ask questions. The board members who should have known. The journalists who called her the next Steve Jobs before a single product had been verified. Theranos didn't fool the world despite Silicon Valley. It fooled the world because of it. Elizabeth Holmes was 19 years old when she dropped out of Stanford in 2003 with an idea so simple it seemed obvious. What if you could run hundreds of medical tests from a single drop of blood, without needles, without labs, in minutes? Not hours, not days, minutes. The technology didn't exist. But the idea was real enough that people, serious people, were willing to believe it could. Holmes understood something that most founders miss. In Silicon Valley, the vision matters more than the product. Steve Jobs had convinced the world the iPhone existed before anyone had touched one. Elon Musk had promised full self-driving for a decade without delivering it. The pattern was clear: you sell the future first, then you build it. Holmes adopted every element of that playbook deliberately. The black turtleneck, the dramatic pauses, the refusal to show the product to outsiders. She wasn't copying Jobs by accident. She was copying the behavior that Silicon Valley had trained everyone to reward. But here's what nobody said out loud at the time. There is a difference between faking a product roadmap and faking a medical device. One disappoints investors. The other kills patients. And in 2003, 2005, 2010, nobody in Silicon Valley was thinking about that distinction. They were thinking about the upside. I want you to look at this board of directors and tell me what you notice. George Shultz, former U.S. Secretary of State. Henry Kissinger, former National Security Advisor. James Mattis, four-star general, future Secretary of Defense. William Perry, former Secretary of Defense. Two former U.S. Senators. The CEO of Bechtel. The former director of the CDC. This was the board of a blood testing startup, not a defense contractor, not a government agency. A startup. Why? Because Holmes understood that legitimacy is transferable. You don't need to prove your technology works if the people sitting next to you have already proven themselves. Every investor who considered Theranos saw that board and thought, surely Kissinger's people checked the science. Surely Mattis had due diligence done. Nobody did. Each person assumed someone else had verified the fundamental claim. It's the same mechanism we saw at FTX collective outsourcing of critical thinking. Except this time the stakes weren't financial. They were medical. And Holmes had one more layer of protection: secrecy. Anyone who joined the board, invested, or worked at Theranos signed ND. As so aggressive, they were essentially legally prevented from asking the one question that would have ended everything. Can we see the machine work? The technology was protected as a trade secret, which meant that verifying whether it worked would have required violating the NDA. The legal structure made due diligence nearly impossible, and Holmes had designed it that way. So, what was inside the Edison, the device Theranos claimed could run 240 tests from a single finger prick? For years, nobody outside the company knew. When the truth finally emerged, it was worse than anyone had expected. The Edison could reliably perform only a handful of tests. For the rest, the majority of the tests Theranos was selling to patients, the company was secretly using conventional machines from Siemens and other manufacturers. the same equipment available at any standard lab. They were diluting blood samples to make them work in machines not designed for finger prick volumes. The results were wildly inaccurate, and they were being sent to patients making real medical decisions. Here is where the story stops being about Silicon Valley hubris and becomes something harder to watch. A woman in Arizona received a false positive for HIV. She spent weeks believing she had the virus before a retest corrected the result. A man received inaccurate PSA readings that led to unnecessary medical procedures. Doctors across the Walgreens network were receiving lab results they trusted because they came from a lab without knowing those results were unreliable. We don't know how many patients were harmed. Theranos never disclosed it. Neither did Walgreens. Inside Theranos, people knew. Lab directors resigned. Scientists quit. One employee, Tyler Schultz, grandson of board member George Schultz, went to California health regulators and to journalist John Carreyrou at the Wall Street Journal. Theranos responded by hiring private investigators to follow him. They pressured his grandfather to cut contact with him. When Carreyrou began investigating, Holmes called his editors personally to kill the story. The suppression was as sophisticated as the fraud. In October 2015, the Wall Street Journal published John Carreyrou's investigation. The story was carefully worded. Theranos threatened legal action before publication, but the core claim was clear. The technology didn't work as advertised. Holmes went on CNBC the next day and called the story factually and scientifically wrong. The stock didn't exist. Theranos was private, but the valuation, which had reached $9 billion, began to crumble in the minds of every investor who read that article. Then came the government. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services inspected the Newark, California lab in 2015 and found conditions so deficient they posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. In 2016, CMS banned Holmes personally from operating any clinical laboratory for 2 years and revoked Theranos' lab certification. The Walgreens partnership ended. The Safeway deal, worth $400 million, collapsed. Within months, a company valued at $9 billion was effectively worthless. In 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts of criminal fraud. She was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. Ramesh Sunny Balwani, her partner, and Theranos president received nearly 13 years. And then something strange happened. People started to debate whether the sentence was too harsh, whether Holmes was a visionary who got in over her head, whether the investors who lost money were really victims at all, given they were billionaires who could absorb the loss. That debate tells you everything about how Silicon Valley still sees this story. Here is the uncomfortable question nobody in Silicon Valley wants to answer. If Elizabeth Holmes had figured out the technology, if the Edison had worked, would any of this have been wrong? The NDAs, the secrecy, the manufactured aura of genius, the boardroom full of political names who didn't understand blood chemistry if the machine had worked, that would all be called visionary leadership. The fraud wasn't in the behavior. The fraud was in the gap between the promise and the reality. And Silicon Valley is built entirely on that gap. Move fast and break things. Disrupt first. Regulate later. The product is the vision the technology will catch up. These aren't fringe beliefs in Silicon Valley. They are the official operating philosophy of the most powerful and well-funded industry in human history. And for software, they mostly work. A buggy app gets patched. A failing social network gets pivoted. The downside is a bad user experience, but when you apply that same philosophy to blood diagnostics, to autonomous vehicles, to AI systems making medical decisions, the downside is not a bad user experience. The downside is someone gets hurt, and the industry still hasn't fully reckoned with that. We saw the same pattern at FTX, a founder with a compelling moral mission, institutional investors who outsourced their skepticism, a structure designed to prevent verification. We saw it at WeWork, a real estate company that convinced the world it was a technology platform worth $47 billion. We see it every year in a new form. The names change. The sector changes. The mechanism is always identical. Find something people want to believe, make the belief socially expensive to question, and move fast enough that the gap between promise and reality never has time to close. Sometimes it does close, and sometimes people get hurt before it does. Elizabeth Holmes is in prison. The investors lost their money. The patients, the ones who received false diagnoses, who made medical decisions based on inaccurate data, most of them never got an apology. They were never even told. And Walgreens, which ran Theranos tests in its pharmacies for 2 years, while red flags multiplied internally, paid a settlement and moved on. Silicon Valley learned some lessons. Mostly it learned to be more careful about which industries it disrupts first. The philosophy, fake it till you make it, is still the operating system. It's just running on different hardware now. The question isn't whether this will happen again. It's whether you'll recognize it before the gap closes. Theranos raised $9 billion on a promise. The promise was that technology could save lives. It was a good promise. It was just never true. And the system that funded it, the system that celebrated it, that protected it, that looked the other way, that system is still running. It just moved on to the next pitch.